The 88th is started. It's going pretty fast and furious right now. Here are some of the topics that are sort of leading the conversation. In Austin, of course, property tax cuts, that is top priority here in Austin. But we are also very interested in school funding increases, and so basic allotment enhancements are being discussed, switching to enrollment-based funding, if not for the whole school finance system, at least for certain allotments, is currently in various school finance proposals. Curriculum standard changes and also curriculum supports is something that's taking up a lot of or is a subject of a lot of conversations here in Austin. And by that I mean changes to the standards, which the social studies standards or the sex ed standards, kind of those fights that we had last session. Changing what's taught and so what's allowable in a classroom. So it's all those same fun arguments again. And then also curriculum support. So what TEA is providing districts in terms of open source materials. This is a new initiative from the agency that the commissioner is very much behind and is pushing this session. And so there's very likely to be a bill that sort of authorizes TEA to provide a statewide open source curriculum that would be either low cost or no cost to school districts. They've been piloting this. I think the district that they've been piloting, maybe several, but at least I think Temple is one that they've been piloting. I believe they've been talking about this on the superintendent calls. So hopefully you guys have your leadership has been made aware of this and kind of what the agency is trying to accomplish here. But this is something that will likely come out of this session. And so, we'll learn more as those bills get moved through the process. But that's another resource that the state is looking to provide school districts. Of course, assessment and accountability, there's always changes in that area. And specifically, I'm talking about, the academic accountability. Well, I'll let David and his team talk about the financial accountability. But, changes with regards to what's tested, what the House Bill 4545 requirements are. There's been a discussion to add a school safety domain to the accountability system. So all sorts of changes to the assessment and accountability system here in Texas are sort of on the table. Of course, discipline, mental health, school safety, I'm kind of bundling all those things together. There's changes in how your threat assessment teams will work, changes to how the school safety allotment is calculated, what you can spend your school safety allotment on, how your discipline processes work in your school district. And so all just really revisiting pretty much every element of that whole system this session. Of course, teacher pay and TRS benefits is also being discussed, changes to those. We've seen a number of bills that would provide supplemental payments to retirees of a certain age, would change sort of how those benefits are calculated. One interesting proposal would sort of do almost like a profit sharing sort of arrangement with TRS. If the TRS fund meets certain investment performance thresholds, then a COLA would be provided to TRS retirees. And so that's interesting, and I think that's getting a lot of support. At least in the House, they want to increase the TRS contributions up to 9% on both the state and the employee side. And so that would be, that would impact all of y'all. So just be aware that's being discussed as well. The Senate does not have increase in the contribution rate, but so we'll see kind of how that all shakes out. But these are the topics that are really kind of leading the day in Austin. Of course, vouchers is also, that was on the docket this week. I didn't include that in here because I'm hoping, probably irrationally hoping that topic goes away, but That is also something that's driving the conversation here in Austin, and we'll talk about that more later on. So we've seen just a record level of bills being filed. Really, a lot of the action is over in the House. You can see the House bills and joint resolutions for the first time has crossed the 5,000 threshold. And so just a lot of ideas, not necessarily all good ones, but a lot of ideas, a lot of proposals this session. And a lot of work for us to sift through all these and analyze them and sort of summarize them for y'all. And so of those, 8,000 pieces of legislation, we are tracking almost 1,500 of them in our legislative tracker. And we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but just want to sort of remind y'all that this resource is on our website. You do have to log in to access it, but we are updating this every day. And I just kind of want to remind y'all how this works and how you can access it. But it's that main banner on our homepage. Again, we do have 1,500 bills in here, so it takes just a couple seconds to load. Let's see here. But once this does load, you can see we have all these filters here at the top, and it makes it really easy for y'all to track what the latest things that are happening. If you're just interested in a particular area, you can sort of hone in on that. For this crowd, you're probably mostly interested in the finance bills and the property tax bills. So you can go and click those two topics and then see the latest happenings there. So, for example, we have House Bill 2. We'll talk about this later on, but you can see, okay, this was voted, this made it out of committee. And then you can open this up and see our write-up on that. And we try and update this at least every day, sometimes multiple times a day. So it just kind of helps y'all to the extent you have free time. If you want to try and follow the conversation in Austin, you can. We think this tool makes it pretty easy to do that. A couple other filters I just want to highlight real quick. If you want to see things that have just passed, House bills that have passed the House or Senate bills that have passed the Senate, you can click on that box to things that have passed the first chamber. And you can see we have some pretty major property tax bills, at least from the Senate, that have made it out of the Senate and are now over in the House. And so, again, we'll talk about what all these bills do here in a moment, but just want to sort of highlight that filter as well as something that I find useful whenever I'm on this page. And then also we have this notable bills filter here. That's just this little star here. It's a purely Moat Casey subjective rating of things that probably of that 1,500 bills, total bills that we're tracking, maybe the top, I think it's top 100 or 100, 120 bills that would really kind of move the needle on some pretty major things with regards to sort of how your district operates. So of course the main state budget is gonna be a pretty important bill to track. So that one gets a notable bill designation. But if you kind of really want to hone in on those major pieces of legislation, that would be the filter to do that. If you have any questions about how to access this tracker or you're having trouble logging in or anything like that, you can email myself or Justin Barlow in our office. And we'll put up his email in the chat here in a moment. And we are happy to get y'all plugged in on that. All Region 1 districts have access to this. And so everybody in this room, everyone on this call should be able to log in and check out that tool. All right. So let's start with some of the new faces that are sort of leading the public ed policy conversation here in this. We'll start with the Senate. You can see we do have some new faces on the Senate Ed Committee. I have Senator Brandon Creighton designated there as newish because he was named as the chair during the interim, but this is his first session as the chair, so he gets a newish designation there. But we do have some other new faces. Senator Peter Flores from Pleasanton, Senator Phil King joins the committee, was previously over in the House. Senator Morgan Lamantia, you guys are very likely familiar with her. She is a new appointee to the committee. Senator Donna Campbell has served on the committee before, but this is her first time as the chair. I don't think she was on the committee last session, but she was on the committee in sessions prior to that. Senator Mays Middleton, Senator Tam Parker, Senator Drew Springer also are new to the committee and joined the Senate from the House. And then some of those other faces should look pretty familiar to y'all. They served on the committee in the past. Senator Paxton was formerly the vice chair, but she got some other roles on other committees, and so she is just returning as a member of the Senate Ed Committee. Over in the House, we have a new chair as well, Representative Brad Buckley. He is a former school board member in Killeen, and Amy's heard me point this out a couple times, but I just find it interesting. He's also a veterinarian from Killeen, which, just as a fun historical note, we have had a previous chair of the House Pub Ed Committee that was a veterinarian from Killeen, Representative Jimmy Don Aycock, was a couple chairs ago. Yeah, so next time at school public ed policy trivia night, you'll be able to answer that question and score a point for your team. So just store that away in your totally useless public ed policy trivia factoid there. Some other new faces on the House Pub Ed Committee: Representative Charles Cunningham, Representative Cody Harris, Representative Brian Harrison, Cole Hefner, Matt Schaefer, Oscar Longoria. Oscar Longoria is not a freshman; he's been in the House for a while, but new to the committee. Representative Gina Hinojosa is a new member to the House Pub Ed Committee. Representative Alma Allen has been on the committee for a while, and she's actually been vice chair before, but we are just calling her new because she was not the vice chair last session. And so right when this lineup was announced, when Speaker Phelan unveiled who was going to be on the House Pub Ed Committee, immediately the next question we got was, okay, what does this mean for vouchers? And so we went and looked and see, okay, what's been their historical position on vouchers, how have they voted on it in the past, and this is what we came up with. We see sort of 3 yes votes on vouchers, given historical statements, historical votes, bills filed in the past, that kind of thing. And so, obviously, majority of the committee is not supportive of vouchers, but I do want to caution y'all, this is just based on their historical statements and votes and that kind of thing. This is not necessarily an indication of what they may do in the future. But regardless, we are, when this was announced, we were sort of comforted by, the fact that, there are only 3 very likely yes votes on vouchers on this committee. Traditionally, the House Pub Ed has been where voucher bills go to die, and it appears to be, this committee appears to be constructed in such a way where that is likely to be the case this session. One thing I also like to point out is former school board members that are on the committee, and so I want to do that real quickly. Brad Buckley is a former school board member. I think I mentioned that already, actually, in Killeen. Representative Charles Cunningham is a former school board member. Representative Gina Hinojosa is a former school board member in Austin. And Representative Ken King is a former school board member as well. So we always like to, we always like it when Pub Ed folks get named to this committee because they bring that a really valuable perspective to the policy making that goes on here. Moving right along, you guys have seen this slide before, but just want to again kind of remind y'all that as the as the budget writers are doing their work this session, they have access to really unprecedented levels of surpluses, $33 billion in GR, another almost 30 billion in rainy day fund, and then another $3 billion in American Rescue Plan money that budget writers have access to. Of course, while this is a good position to be in, it's better to have these surpluses than not have them. The state does have spending limits, and I know we've talked about this in the past, but just want to reiterate that that there are several state spending limits. I think there's 5 in total. We have sort of the 3 major ones highlighted here, really, and the only one that we're sort of focused on right now is that tax spending limit, that first one on the left, and that limit restricts non-constitutionally dedicated appropriations to the state's economic growth rate. And the LBB, the Legislative Budget Board, has adopted that growth rate. And so you plug that in, and that essentially limits the appropriation growth to $12.5 billion over the current biennium. I do want to point out that if the state passes a supplemental appropriations bill, that would increase that $12.5 billion. And so the way this works is it's a percentage that's applied against the appropriation from the current biennium. So if that appropriation grows, that percentage gets a little bit bigger. So that number could change, or would likely change when a supplemental bill is passed. And we'll talk about a supplemental bill here in a moment. But that does kind of restrict, that takes some money off the table. So even though the state has all those money in surplus, it can't spend all of it unless it votes to exceed that tax spending limit. And fortunately, that tax spending limit does have the lowest threshold. It just requires a simple majority vote in each chamber to exceed. The state does have to designate an emergency reason to exceed that threshold. Our reading of those requirements are that it's not very strict on what qualifies as an emergency. State leaders and lawmakers could very well decide that COVID learning loss is an emergency warranting, exceeding that threshold, and flow more money to schools for that reason. And so, we don't want, I think at this stage in the process, folks are, at least budget writers, are very cognizant of that tax spending limit and trying to stay under that, but we're trying to point out that it doesn't have to be that way. The state could very well access more money from those surpluses just with a simple majority vote. And schools have needs right now, and we don't need to hold ourselves to these limits when those needs are as great as they are right now. And so just if you want, to the extent you want to get engaged and have your school board and superintendent, get engaged in the legislative process, I think it's important to point out that it's just a simple majority vote to exceed that tax spending limit. So we don't need to, really restrict ourselves too much in that regard. So looking at the budget, things are a little lopsided in our opinion. We have about $15 billion in property tax cuts, and this is true in both the House and the Senate. And on at least in the House sort of school finance bill is a little bit further along than on the Senate side. But the sort of understanding that we have is that there's about $5 billion in the budget for new funding for schools. So you can see, things are a little bit out of balance here. But we'll walk through some of the provisions in the budget and some of the proposals on the school finance side here now. So of course, property tax cuts is really taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room this session. Both chambers, as I mentioned, are proposing $15 billion in property tax cuts. 10 billion of that is above current law. So, $5 billion is kind of required under the provisions that are in 1525, House Bill 1525 and House Bill 3. But the state is wanting to go above and beyond that to the tune of $10 billion and provide property tax relief, additional property tax relief. And the way they want to deliver that is a little different, depending on what chamber you're looking at. The House has some ideas and the Senate has other ideas. The House wants to do 15 cents of sort of uniform compression for all ISDs, and that's tier 1 compression. And they also want to lower the appraisal cap to 5%, and they want to apply that to all real property. And we'll talk more about that here in a moment. But right now that appraisal cap limit is 10%, and it only applies to resident homesteads, right? So they want to lower that to 5% and make it apply to commercial property, mobile homes, all sorts of additional real property. And we'll talk about implications there here in a moment. The Senate doesn't like this appraisal cap limit idea. They do want to do some uniform tax compression. I think it's around 7-8 pennies of uniform tax compression, just lowering everyone's tier 1 rate by, again, around 7-8 pennies. But their idea is to increase the homestead exemption, right? So we just, y'all will recall, we just increased it from 25 to 40,000. Now the Senate wants to take that from 40,000 up to 70,000. And that would cost around $3 billion for the biennium. You can see sort of our take on all that. Generally speaking, if we're going to do property tax relief, I think it's in the best interest of schools to deliver that property tax relief through tier 1 rate compression. And the reason we are pushing that is tier 1 compression is revenue neutral, and it's baked into sort of the fabric of the school finance system. If you think about how homestead exemptions have worked in the past, right? There is sometimes a hold harmless that comes with them, but there's usually a timestamp for that hold harmless as the end date. Sometimes they just repeal the hold harmless altogether, like we saw in House Bill 3. And so there's those, whenever there's a hold harmless sitting there in law, sitting there in the budget, it's easy for lawmakers to identify, and they can scrap it later on. And so with tier 1 compression, that's not going to hurt your bottom line. As your rates get compressed, you either pay less recapture or you get more state aid. And it is not really a line item there in the budget that lawmakers, if they need to down the road, can really cut quite as easily. And so for those reasons, we think tier 1 rate compression is really the way to go. Again, we're having those conversations this session, but we'll see kind of how things shake out as we move forward. Some other items in the budget. So both the House and Senate are going to spend $2.4 billion to increase the golden penny yields. That is not something they're doing, above the current law requirements. That is already in law, so we don't need to. So hold off on writing your thank you letters to your representatives quite yet. We'll see what they do this session. But those yields currently at 98.56 would go up to $126 in 23-24 school year, and then almost $130 in 24-25. And so this, if they do nothing else, schools will get at least $2.4 billion in new funding because of those golden penny yields, and those are rising because of rising property values. Is really kind of the driving force there. Instructional materials has been restored. I say, almost restored. I think the sort of historical level is a little bit higher than $1 billion, but it's at least brought up from the less than $500 million it was last biennium. So that's good news. Schools will have more money there. So yeah, I think that's a positive development. The Strong Foundations grant has gotten continued funding in both the House and Senate budget proposals of $150 million. Cybersecurity has gotten, this is sort of a new initiative, but it's in both the House and Senate bills. $55 million that would sort of flow through DIR or be appropriated to DIR to offer some support to school districts, with cybersecurity. And my understanding is this would kind of work, similar to the school safety center, how they get an appropriation, they provide support and training and auditing and all that kind of stuff for school districts. DIR would potentially do something similar, provide resources and oversight for cybersecurity at school districts. Speaking of school safety, both chambers indicate an intention to pass a supplemental bill that would provide $600 million. And actually, Amy, did this change just recently? Is that right?
Yes. So this just changed yesterday afternoon. The House Appropriations Committee introduced a committee an amendment to their original intention and bumped this $600 million to $1.6 billion for school safety. Awesome.
Yeah. So the governor took that $400 million and gave it, from the surpluses this past year and gave it back to y'all as school safety facility grants. Our understanding is this now $1.6 billion would go to support your school safety facility compliance with those requirements. We'll see kind of what the details are there, sort of how exactly that money flows to schools. But there should be some more help coming in that area.
And this is, and Josh, if I can add, during the during the superintendent call with the commissioner yesterday, he mentioned that in the next week and a half, their TA is really looking for feedback from school districts that think they would need more than the next 18 months to implement provisions of the newly proposed minimum school safety standards. And I think he's wanting this feedback pretty quickly because he is going to provide that information to some of the committees that could continue to change this funding amount for school safety.
All right. So if you need go tell your superintendent to get on it if they're not already. I'm going to move quickly past this slide because we kind of have some ideas of at least what the House wants to do. But in the budget, they have some allusions to what sort of school funding enhancements they have in mind. So basic allotment increase, some other changes to allotments are sort of listed in the budget. When we look at the Senate's budget proposal, the language looks a little different. It's more narrowly focused just on teacher compensation and teacher benefits. And they don't really mention, basic allotment increases and that kind of thing. And so we'll see kind of what each chamber ends up proposing. And then we'll talk more here in a minute about what the House at least has in mind. So for the Senate, the Senate's been moving pretty quickly with the appropriations bill. We just kind of touched on this. In total, that bill spends about $12 billion. In the current biennium, it does make a little bit more than $8 billion reduction in foundation school program appropriations. And the reason it's not going to take money away from y'all, but it just sort of trues up the current biennium appropriations to reflect things like the ESSER supplanting that occurred, the high property value growth that we saw during the current biennium, and then the lower ADA increases that we saw over the current biennium. So again, this is just kind of truing up what was originally appropriated to what actually ended up the state needed to spend on FSP. I'll need to update that third bullet point there. Again, I have $600 million from the American Rescue Plan on school safety. Now it's $1.6 billion. We'll have to check and see if that's all still from the American Rescue Plan.
But actually be all from GR, General Revenue now.
Okay, interesting. So there's still some money left in the American Rescue Plan that is unspent. And so we'll see what the legislature decides to do with that. But they are also spending $1 billion in GR for TRS benefit increases.
And that last amount just changed yesterday afternoon too. It's $3.5 billion in GR.
Yeah. $3.5 billion in GR for TRS.
Yes, for TRS.
All right. So some welcome developments late yesterday in that area. Okay. Let's move on to some property tax proposals. They are, so again, this is really a major focus this session. And we're going to go through some of the sort of what the proposals are in the Senate and the House and how they vary. As I mentioned earlier, the Senate wants to increase the homestead exemption from 40K to 70K. They're also increasing the state mandated exemption for over 65 and disabled from 10K to 30K. And then they have a catch-up provision for over 65 and disabled, sort of looking at the overall homestead exemption, making sure that they're getting the benefit from that. But the main takeaway for y'all is this proposal does include a hold harmless, both on the M&O and INS side. So just like we saw a hold harmless on the change from 25 to 40K. This provides a similar kind of hold harmless from going from 40 to 70, but there is a cutoff there. At least on the INS side, it would cut off with bonds as eligible for state aid as of September 1, 2022. And so let's talk about that hold harmless in a little bit more detail here. This slide shows sort of all of the increases in the homestead exemption. It used to be 5K, way back in the day, and they've made various increases over time. But they haven't covered all of those increases. So you can see on the M&O side, there's no hold harmless provided for the as a result of the losses from 5K to 25K, right? You guys just kind of have to absorb the impact there. And then on the INS side, there's no coverage for the increase from 5K to 15K. And so sticking with the INS side for a little bit, there is coverage from 15K to 25K, but again, that's only going to cover those bonds that were eligible for state aid as of September 1 or prior to September 1, 2015. Everything after that fact doesn't have any hold harmless coverage. And we kind of had a similar thing with this last increase in the homestead exemption up to 40K. That only covers bonds prior to September 1, 2021. And then this potential new increase in the homestead exemption would only cover bonds prior to September 1, 2022. And then on the M&O side, you can see that would there is coverage from 40K to 70K, but that would be calculated using whatever new school finance bill comes out of this session. So a couple things that we've been talking about and observing with regard to this hold harmless is number one, on the INS side, those cutoffs are problematic in that it doesn't cover new bonds, and also not all of these homestead exemption increases are covered. There's no hold harmlesses for covering every homestead exemption increase that the legislature has put in place. And then also you're going to need to know 3 different versions of school finance to calculate your hold harmless. And that's makes it very difficult for y'all to calculate, for TEA to implement. And it makes it less transparent and less easy for you guys to plan on. And so it's unnecessarily complicated to have 3 to just layer all these different versions of school finance on top of each other. And so we're trying to push for a more simpler, more comprehensive hold harmless in this area. So we'll see kind of how that how those conversations play out. But this is kind of what the proposals are at the moment. The Senate also has another proposal that's more narrowly focused on school district tax compression. Senate Bill 4 lowers the tax compression floor from 90% to 80%. So, right now districts, there's a tax ceiling that's calculated based on the controller growth estimate. Districts can only be compressed down to 90% of that tax ceiling. This bill would expand that to be 80% of that tax ceiling. And then the bill would also spend about $5.5 billion on sort of uniform compression of 7 to 8 pennies. That would apply to everybody. The reason they're sort of expanding that tax compression floor is at least the goal is to try to prevent districts from all sort of congregating down at that floor. Right now we have a little bit more than 700 districts down at that floor. And so the thinking is if they expand that, threshold, it will sort of allow for more variation in the tax rates and prevent districts from again all gathering down at that floor. We're not exactly certain that would happen if they expand that floor, because again, that ceiling is going to depend on the controller growth estimate, which historically has been very, very conservative. It's in the single digits, whereas we've seen growth in double digits the past couple of years. And so as long as that ceiling is tied to the controller growth estimate, you're going to have districts catch up with that floor, and we'll be right back in this position in 2-3 years. And then additionally, there is constitutionality concerns here. If we do have this unequal distribution of tax rates, where in some areas of the state they have really low tax rates, but they're getting more state aid, that sort of calls into question the equality and the uniformness of the state's property tax system. And so we know that the Supreme Court is okay with a 90% threshold. It could sort of open up the state to litigation potentially if that variation expands to 80%. And we don't know where the Supreme Court will draw that line, but that is a concern as we increase that variability there with the Tier 1 tax compression. Senate Bill 5 is another property tax bill. It would increase the business personal property exemption currently at $2,500 to $25,000. It would cost the state around $150 to $180 million in additional state aid or reduced recapture. And so that's I think the rationale behind this bill is all the business owners were upset that the homestead exemption went up and they didn't get a slice of the pie. And so this is really throwing a bone to the business personal property owners. So But again, this would take value off the rolls. It's going to not have a huge impact on the M&O side because of the way as value if value goes down, you get more state aid or pay less recapture. It could impact you on the INS side, right? Because many districts don't get INS state aid. And so as that value goes off, you just lose that for INS purposes. You don't necessarily get offset with INS state aid. So moving over to the House, this did pass out of committee. And what this bill does is it provides 15 cents of uniform tax compression. It doesn't change that compression floor. It keeps it at 90%. But it does reduce the appraisal growth limit, as I mentioned earlier, from 10% down to 5%, and it applies it to all real property, right? So under this proposal, it would no longer just be resident homesteads that would be subject to that. And so one thing we kind of want to point out here is lowering this from 5% is going to make it much more likely that we have this weird situation where the taxes that a taxpayer has to pay is going to be dependent on sort of how recently they acquired the property or how recently that property was sold. Because if you kind of think about it, what this graph shows is, at least in these first 2 years, oh, I realize I have bad labels there. I need to update that. But let's pretend this one says 23 here. Both properties, the blue property and the orange property here, would be subject to the 5% appraisal limit growth in these initial years. But in this example, in 26, that property is sold to a new owner, and that resets the clock on that appraisal limit. And so both properties would have the same tax or would have the same market value, but because the orange line was sold to a new owner, that resets the clock for the appraisal limit. And just because that changed hands, now their appraisal limit or their appraised value is much higher than if that same property would have stayed with the same owner. And you see things like this in states that have really aggressive appraisal limits, like in California, right? There's all and we see all this kind of crazy tax avoidance strategies that occur in states like California. And I think Florida has a pretty low appraisal limit as well. And so it just creates all these weird incentives in the real estate industry. And sort of more more importantly for y'all is it would impact you on the INS side, right? And so as most of the time, at least lately, everyone's kind of seeing at least more than 5% value growth year over year, right? So all that value gets taken off the rolls, at least for a year, and then you can't tax on it for M&O or INS purposes. But it's more impactful on the INS side, right? Because if that value comes off on the M&O side, the state will make up for more state aid. But on the INS side, that may not be the case, depending on what your values are. I know a lot of y'all in Region 1 do get INS state aid, and so it may make up for some of it, but it may not. That state aid may not fully offset the impact of this appraisal limits change and the impact that has on your property values, right? So those property values would go off the rolls, and you may have to levy a higher INS tax rate as a result. So this is, particularly worrisome for those of y'all that aren't getting INS state aid and potentially have, facility needs or your growing districts. This is something that a lot of folks are concerned about. moving on to House Bill 100, this is going to be the major vehicle for school finance this session, and I will toss it over to Amy to lead us through these next few slides.
Thanks, Josh. So HB 100 filed by Representative King makes some pretty big changes to school finance in the upcoming school years. This bill hasn't been set for hearing yet, but we suspect that it'll get heard in early April after some of the big blanks in the bill have been filled in. Estimates right now, we believe that it would increase state costs about $1.5 billion per year. This bill also increases the basic allotment by $50 to $62.10 beginning in the next school year. And it requires school districts and charters to use 50% of that basic allotment increase to increase the average total compensation for the classroom teachers, full-time librarians, counselors, and school nurses. And the bill also specifies that districts can't include new teacher, librarian, counselor, nurses, positions to satisfy that 50% spending requirement. Okay. And then on the next slide, this bill makes several changes to current FSP allotments that are based on ADA to change them to be based on average enrollment. So we've got the whole list here. It would affect your IFA EDA, small mid-size allotment, bilingual, CTE, gifted and talented, public education, grant, your early ed allotment, and the dropout recovery school and residential placement facilities allotment. All of these changes, if the bill passes, would take effect in the 24-25 school year. Okay, a few more changes. We got some hands up from Connie. So a few other changes that this bill does, it increases the transportation allotment to be the greater of $1.54 per mile per eligible student, or the rate set in the General Appropriations Act. And this would bring an additional roughly $180 million, or cost the state that much additional. Excuse me. The bill also adds a brand new allotment. This one is the allotment for advanced mathematics pathways in certain programs of study. Districts would be eligible for $10 per enrolled student, and small and mid-sized districts would get that $10 plus an additional 10% of their district's small and mid-sized per student amount. So this allotment is basically for high school students that take increasingly challenging math courses from 9th grade until 12th grade. And the last bullet here on this slide, HB 100 extends the formula transition grant to the 29-30 school year. Right now, I believe it's set to expire at the end of 24-25, and this would cost the state about a little over $190 million in the 25-26 school year.
I think it may actually be in the 24-25, so apologies for that.
Yeah, the bill also increases the comp ed weights just a little bit. We're waiting for the committee substitute to get more specific numbers on how the comp ed allotment would actually change. And one of the other big things that HB 100 does is that it increases the minimum salary schedule. And because of that, this bill creates the salary transition allotment that would be calculated by TA in 23-24 and 24-25 and used to offset those salary increases. We've been estimating that this would cost $40 to $50 million for the state, and this salary transition allotment would slowly phase out over the course of the next 3 school years. 3 or 4 school years, and then eventually expire at the end of the 28-29 school year. Excuse me. So Romalda has a question about average enrollment. Josh, could you help define that and how it's different than just like counts and ADA?
Yeah, the bill does not provide a whole lot of explanation there. So I'll just show you the language. It really just says right here, the number of students in average enrollment, and kind of leaves it there. So I think it would be, I think elsewhere in the bill, it says the commissioner is going to figure it out. And so that's kind of where things are right now, because, you know, as we know, we have the fall PEEM snapshot, you know, that's submitted to the state. But, you know, exactly how that would be calculated, you know, would vary. I would assume it would perhaps be the average of, you know, each 6 weeks, kind of like how, you know, ADA is taken. You know, they take your enrollment each 6 weeks and then average that. That would be my assumption, but we'll see. I will try and get some more clarity on that for y'all, and see exactly what form that takes.
Okay, so moving over to school safety, the House has created a new select committee called the House Youth Health and Safety Select Committee, and they've been taking a close look and considering a bunch of bills that deal with youth health and discipline, but also many bills that relate to public education. So one of the first bills, notable bills that we're tracking closely is HB 3. This is set for hearing on Monday. We've kind of deemed this school safety day in the Capitol. HB 3 would require school campuses to have an armed school security officer in every campus during regular school hours. This bill also requires school districts to conduct a safety and security audit once every 3 years, requires TA to monitor the implementation of this bill and some of those new requirements. And it adds a little tiny bit of money to the school safety allotment, increasing it by 28 cents to $10 per student in ADA. And then plus $1 per student in ADA for every increase in the BA exceeding 6160. So if the BA increases, that would be an additional $1 to that $10 proposed $10 for the school safety allotment.
Just to be clear, that's if I understand that correctly, that's if your basic allotment is increased because of the small and mid-size allotment, right? So that you get the $10, and then if you're small and mid-size, you could potentially get more than that amount.
Oh, got it. Thanks for clarifying, Josh. This bill also has a campus funding floor of $15,000. And we've mentioned this many times before that school security and safety costs don't necessarily scale with ADA. So we're grateful that there is some campus funding floor in this bill, but I think we can all agree that $15,000 is clearly not enough. On the Senate side, they have a very similar bill to HB 3. SB 11 would require that ESCs act as a school safety resource for LEAs. I think this would include some technical assistance and some providing some other guidance. Same as HB3, it requires TA to monitor school district safety and security, implementation of requirements. This bill provides the same amount of increase for the school safety allotment, bringing it up to a whopping $10 per ADA, also including that campus funding floor of $15,000. And one of the big changes from HB3 is that SB 11 requires districts and charter schools to refer a student to a truancy court if they have more than 6 unexcused absences in an 8-week period. And we believe this is a response to some of those truancy provisions and requirements being a little bit more lenient recently, and they're trying to tighten that back up a little bit. We've got another school safety bill that is set for hearing on Monday. HB 13, filed by Representative King, would require mental health first aid training for all school district employees that regularly interact with students. And all of this needs to be completed by the 28-29 school year. This bill would also permit school guardians to be on campus. This is someone who's authorized to carry a weapon on campus, and they would have to go to receive certain training and meet other requirements. But these school guardians would be eligible to receive an annual stipend of up to $25,000 each school year. Or a couple other things in this bill. It requires LEAs to adopt and implement an active shooter preparedness plan, and it increases the school safety allotment to $100 per student in ADA, which we welcome. Next, for one of the bills that got heard earlier this week is SB 9. This deals with providing salary increases to teachers. The language is not specifically, it's not specific enough in the bill right now, but the bill would provide a different increase for districts that have less than 20,000 enrolled students. During the hearing earlier this week, there was some mention that this teacher salary increase could be around $2,000. And many people, especially from school districts and parents, testified that $2,000 is not going to be enough. And if this bill is trying to implement recommendations from the teacher vacancy task force, this teacher salary increase should be more along the lines of $10,000 to $14,000 each year. So we'll see where this goes. We haven't got our hands on the substitute language yet. This bill would also make some pretty big changes to the teacher incentive allotment, including adding a new accomplished designation, and then classifying teachers that have a national board certification as a master teacher. There's been, we've heard that it can be really difficult to stand up a program to evaluate teachers for the TIA, but potentially making an easier designation would allow more teachers to qualify for that strategic funding that Jay likes to call.
Yeah, and so right now, I think the national board certification automatically qualifies you as the whatever that lowest certificate, that lowest designation is, and so this moves it to the highest one, and so that could pretty significantly increase the the funding that's flowing through that TIA. So that should make things a little bit easier. I know Region 1 has done a lot of work to support folks on getting their teacher incentive system, put together and approved by the state. And so, that may help some of y'all, particularly those of y'all that have not gone through that local designation system approval process.
Okay. So the bill would also change the mentor program allotment so that each teacher being trained, being mentored would generate a $2,000 allotment. The bill would also create a teacher residency partnership program and provide an allotment between $22,000 and $42,000 for each participating resident. The bill also removes some of the rehire penalties, making it easier for retired school teachers to come back and teach. And lastly, this bill would also make changes on disciplinary actions that could be taken by a teacher and specify when that student could return to the classroom.
Yeah, and so if a teacher removes a student from the classroom, that adds extra steps that campus administrators have to do before they can send that student back. It also makes some changes on notifications you have to give the teacher and what kind of supplemental duties when you have to make decisions around assignment of supplemental duties and that kind of thing. And so it's all about essentially trying to make it the working conditions of teachers a little bit better, and the increased pay and all that kind of stuff. And so this was subject of a lot of testimony, mostly positive, I think, from teachers during the session or during the committee hearing. But also on that same committee meeting was all the voucher bills, which is what we'll talk about next. So a little bit good with the bad, I guess. I'm going to kind of move through these quickly. There are a couple different voucher bills. One of the major ones, Senate Bill 8 by Chairman Creighton, creates these education savings accounts, and those can be used for tuition, for instructional materials, for a whole host of things. This program would be sort of implemented by the controller's office, and the controller would work with these new entities called educational assistance organizations that would sort of be on the front line working with families to get their applications approved, to help them identify eligible costs for that they could use this new savings account on. It does have a prior public requirement that to be eligible for this. The student has to have attended public school for at least 90% of the prior year, or be enrolling in pre-K or kindergarten for the first time. And so that's at a very high level what's going on with Senate Bill 8. Some more information about sort of the amount that would be included in there. And you can see that listed there. Each student will qualify for around $8,000 a year. Again, this could change. And then there's also, I think, that third bullet point there, they included some sort of kind of like a hold harmless provision for smaller districts. I think to try and at least maybe not get support from smaller districts, but at least stop opposition from smaller districts to this bill. I don't think that's been very successful. It seems like the school community has been pretty united in opposition to this bill, and so hopefully that continues. But they are trying to kind of carve up the public ed committee, or not committee, the public ed community in sort of their opposition to this bill. And so you can see some other differences there listed out. Include some language on parental rights. Much of it is parents already have the ability to do a lot of those things that are sort of spelled out in the bill. Also, this bill, Senate Bill 8, doesn't restrict eligibility to any certain group, right? In voucher bills, this session and in prior sessions, we've seen, special ed vouchers or economically disadvantaged vouchers. This is sort of more broadly for all students. Some other voucher bills that were heard and that have been filed this session: Senate Bill 176 is again a sort of vouchers for all proposal. It has a slightly different calculation there for what parents could access. It's $10,725, or sort of our estimate of that would be accessible for parents that chose to take advantage of that empowerment program. Again, it does have a sort of a prior public component to it, and so that's Senate Bill 176. Senate Bill 2354 from Betancourt is more narrowly focused just on vouchers for certain economically disadvantaged students, and you can see the eligibility requirements listed out there. It also has a different amount that would be that families would be able to access, so a little bit less, according to our understanding of the language. It'd be around $9,600, $9,700 would be accessible there. Senate Bill 960, again, it's sort of similar kind of construction here, except that the amount would be a little bit lower. This calculation is based on charter funding, right? So it's 60% of charter funding. So that would be around $6,600 that families could access through that grant. And then SJR 29 just sort of puts in some parental rights in the Constitution. You can see those listed out there. Again, parents can pretty much do all those things already. And I think schools would very much welcome more parental involvement and more, closer relationship with parents. And so, this is largely just a political, flag in the sand. This is not really changing fundamentally what parents can and can't do under law. Okay, so that's all the fun stuff going on in the session. We're going to switch gears here a little bit, and I don't want to take too much away from our friends at TEA, but there are some sort of school finance updates we just want to hit real quick before we wrap up. Y'all may be aware that they've updated summer finances in a couple of different areas. We've seen new property or the preliminary PBS results loaded in, and that had some major impacts on state aid and recapture amounts on the summary finance. And so loading in those PBS values reduced state aid by about $1.5 billion compared to the LPE prior to that update. And the state share has gone down to around 31%. You may hear different numbers, when you're listening to, testimony, or you're seeing other documents from lawmakers. But just, the way we calculate that 31% is we're looking at both M&O and INS. That's an important distinction. And we're not counting recapture as state aid, right? We're counting that as local dollars because it's from a locally administered property tax, right? And so that's kind of how we calculate the state share. And so again, you may see numbers as high as 40% elsewhere. But generally speaking, those higher numbers are going to be just looking at M&O. And they're going to be including recapture as state money rather than local money. speaking of recapture, loading in those higher values increased recapture by about $1 billion. And so that's at a very high level, kind of the impact of those PBS values. The state could be looking at a surplus of around $3 billion, maybe $3.5 billion for this school year based on those higher values. We'll see again once we get all the ADA data and everything else plugged in, kind of where things shake out. But that's our understanding currently. Another thing, another change you may have seen on your summary finance is the state has plugged in data from your fall PEIM snapshot, right? And so that's going to impact your comp ed funding first off, right? We know comp ed is based on is not based on ADA, it's based on your fall snapshot counts. Once TEA got those fall snapshot counts, they also rebalanced those tiers. And by that, I mean they recategorized those block groups so that at least 700 million kids, give or take, it's not exactly 700 million, but close to that, are in each tier. This is something that sort of irritated me when House Bill 3 was first passed, and it's something, if Amy's ever elected governor, maybe she can point me as the education commissioner, and I'll get this fixed for y'all. But it's something that irritates me, and I just wanted to point it out that if they do this rebalancing, and the effect that it has is you can see here that they don't include even numbers of block groups in each tier. Again, they balance so that even numbers of students are in each tier. And so it's intuitive that there's fewer comp ed kids in the least economically disadvantaged block groups in the state, right? And so this tier 1 level, for example, these are the least economically disadvantaged communities in the state, according to the census. And it takes, you have to gather up 6,000 of those block groups to find 700,000 comp ed students. If you look at tier 5, again, these are the most economically disadvantaged block groups in the state. It only takes 2,400 of those block groups to find 700,000 comp ed students. And so my point is, by rebalancing on the count of comp ed students, you're really shifting a lot more comp ed students to be funded at the tier 1 level than at the tier 5 level. If they instead balance based on block groups and sort of distributed block groups evenly across the tiers, you would get a lot more comp ed students in these tier 3, 4, and 5 ranges, right? And so again, we don't have all the data to do an exact comparison. Maybe we can ask this question of our, not to put our friends at TEA on the spot, but it'd be an interesting exercise for them. But our estimates are it would increase comp ed funding, if they balanced it by block groups. That's $150 million potentially of additional comp ed funding that districts aren't getting because of the way the state has balanced the comp ed allotment. And so that's my spiel on that. I'll get off my soapbox there, but I do just want to point out that there is this these sort of implementation questions that have come up with House Bill 3 that are really shaving off some of the comp ed funding that if we had a different strategy here, you could be getting some more comp ed funding there. But at any rate, you have seen these new comp ed counts have been loaded in to summary finance, and you will see those reflected in your funding. And so that's been put in there. You'll also see on the DPE side TEA has updated those counts as well to reflect your enrollment, right? And so I know they'll talk about this more here in a moment, but essentially they take that fall snapshot and adjust it by historical enrollment, the historical ADA to enrollment ratio, and calculate what they think your total ADA will be at the end of the year, right? And they do that same methodology for special ed and for various other counts for funding purposes. And so just, I would look at those DPE counts and see, what the agency is thinking your student counts may be at the end of the school year. And look at your student information system, see how accurate those projections may be. I think generally, at least at a high level, my understanding is that methodology that TEA uses ends up being pretty close. They take, again, those fall snapshot counts, adjust them based on historical ratios, and it ends up being pretty close to where you end up. But I would advise y'all to go make those comparisons yourself. And then quick plug for this document that TEA puts out. And I think we've shared this with y'all in the past. It's on the state funding website, but it goes through where all this data comes from and how it's updated throughout the year. And so we find this to be really useful. So kudos to the folks at TEA for putting this together and putting this out there. And so you can see, for example, on all of these ADA and FTE counts, right? It describes, in each year in March, they take that fall snapshot and then put that on the DPE side. And each time these data elements are changed, you can kind of see a description on what exactly the agency does and how they plug that data in to your summary finances. So with that, I will wrap it up. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to take those now.